Leave it, Nissa. The cold has already claimed it. The village elder's voice was as brittle as the frost, rhyming the eaves of the longhouse. But Nissa didn't look away from the tiny bundle lying in the snowdrift. The wind howled, a vicious beast tearing through the valley, yet she could have sworn she heard a sound thinner than a bird's cry. "It moved," she whispered, her hands trembling as she pulled her thin shawl tighter against the biting cold. "It is an omen of the Ice King, girl, a frozen curse upon us all." The elder spat, turning his back to the storm. "Leave it to the wolves." But the cry came again, undeniable this time. A fragile, desperate gasp for life. Nissa, an Omega with nothing left to lose in a village that despised her kind, stepped off the path and sank into the knee-deep snow, moving toward the dying child. The cold in Vintergard did not just chill the flesh, it sought to extinguish the spirit. Nissa, her breath pluming in white clouds, slogged through the snowdrift, her rough-spun boots offering little protection against the biting frost. The village of Oakhaven lay behind her, its meager fires offering a warmth she was rarely permitted to share. She was an Omega, a rarity in these harsh times, but not a prized one. Not here. In Oakhaven, Omegas were considered weak, burdens meant only for menial labor, until an alpha from a neighboring, wealthier clan came to claim them. A rare occurrence in this desolate corner of the world. She reached the bundle. It was swaddled in fabric far too fine for Oakhaven, a heavy, dark velvet trimmed with silver fur, now stiff with frost. Nissa knelt, the snow soaking through her skirts instantly. With shaking hands, she brushed away a layer of fresh powder. A face emerged. A tiny, perfect face, pale as the snow itself, with lips tinted a terrifying shade of blue. The baby's eyes were closed, its breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. "Oh, little one." Nissa breathed, her heart clenching with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. She didn't know whose child this was, only that it was abandoned and dying. She scooped the bundle into her arms. The moment the child's skin brushed against her bare wrist, a searing heat flared through her veins. It wasn't the agonizing burn of the cold, but a sudden, violent surge of energy that felt like liquid fire. Nissa gasped, stumbling backward. The heat coalesced on her inner forearm, right where the baby's hand had touched her. She scrambled to pull up her sleeve, expecting to see a burn. Instead, she stared in bewildered terror at a mark forming on her skin. A stylized wolf's head, crowned with jagged ice, etched in a stark, glowing blue that slowly faded to a deep, permanent black. It was a mating mark. But not just any mark. Every child in the north knew that symbol, though none had seen it in their lifetime. It was the crest of Lucan, the Alpha King of the Frost Marches, the Ice King. A man who was more myth than mortal, said to have a heart of solid ice and a soul as unforgiving as the blizzard. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. A mating mark from the Alpha King. It was impossible. She was a lowly Omega, and he was a legend. A monster. And this baby, the child stirred, letting out another weak cry. The immediate need eclipsed her fear. The mark didn't matter now. The baby's life did. Nissa huddled over the child, shielding it from the wind, and began the arduous trek back to the edge of the village, avoiding the main path. She couldn't take the child to the elder. He would see the fine clothes, perhaps recognize the scent, and condemn them both. She had to take the baby to her own meager hovel on the outskirts, where she lived in near isolation. The wind tore at her, punishing her every step. But the frantic, instinctual need to protect the life in her arms drove her forward. She slipped through the shadows of the crude wooden palisade and darted into her small, drafty cabin, slamming the door shut against the storm. She built a fire with hands that shook violently, throwing on the last of her precious firewood. The cabin filled with a smoky, desperate warmth. Nissa stripped the freezing velvet away, wrapping the child in her own worn but dry woolen blankets. She held the baby close to her chest, trying to share her own body heat, murmuring soft, frantic reassurances. As the fire crackled, she examined the baby more closely. It was a boy. He was small, perhaps only a few moons old. He lacked the scent of a normal pup. Instead, he smelled faintly of pine needles and something sharp and clean, like the air right before a snowstorm. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, rattling the flimsy door, while inside, Nissa maintained her vigil. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the blue tinge faded from the baby's lips, replaced by a fragile pink. His breathing grew steadier. Exhausted, Nissa finally allowed herself to look at her arm. The black wolf's head sat starkly against her pale skin. She traced it with a trembling finger. It felt hot to the touch, a constant, thrumming reminder of the impossibility of what had just happened. How? She wondered, her mind spinning. How does touching a child give me a king's mark? A sudden, terrifying thought struck her. If this child was connected to the Alpha King, then Lucan would be looking for him. And when the Ice King came looking, he brought the storm with him. Nissa, an Omega with nothing, had just invited the wrath of the North into her fragile world. She pulled the sleeping baby closer, the weight of the king's mark a heavy, burning brand upon her arm, as the first light of a bleak dawn crept through the cracks in the walls. For 3 days, the storm kept Oakhaven isolated, burying the village under feet of snow. For Nissa, it was a blessing. It gave her time to feed the child, whom she had tentatively named Elian, with goat's milk she had hoarded. Time to watch him grow stronger, his pale cheeks finally holding a healthy flush. He was a quiet baby, rarely crying, observing the world with large, startlingly pale blue eyes. Whenever he looked at her, Nissa felt an odd tug in her chest, a profound sense of rightness that warred with her constant fear. And the fear was constant. The mark on her arm pulsed, sometimes a dull ache, other times a sharp sting, a phantom tether connecting her to a man she had never met. She kept it hidden beneath long sleeves, terrified of what the villagers would do if they saw it. They would burn her as a witch, or worse, hand her over to the king's men if they ever arrived. On the 4th day, the wind died down, and the sun broke through the heavy clouds, glinting blindingly off the snow. The silence that followed the storm was absolute. Heavy with a new kind of tension, Nissa ventured out of her cabin to clear the snow from her door, wrapping Elian tightly and tying him to her chest with a sling. The village was waking up. People digging out of their homes, their faces pinched with the cold and the lingering hunger of the long winter. She tried to remain inconspicuous, head bowed, focusing on the rhythmic scraping of her shovel. But Oakhaven was small, and secrets were hard to keep. Well, look who survived the freeze, a voice sneered. Nissa stiffened. It was Kale, a young alpha who took pleasure in tormenting her, his arrogance fueled by his status in the village. He swaggered toward her, kicking a spray of snow in her direction. "And what's that you're hiding, little Omega?" Kyle demanded, his eyes narrowing as he caught the subtle movement beneath Nissa's cloak. "Found a stray mutt to keep you warm?" "Leave me alone, Kale," Nissa said, her voice tight, turning her back to him. "I don't think so," he said, stepping into her path, his hand reaching out. "Let's see what you've got there." Panic surged. If he saw Elian, if he saw the fine clothes she had washed and tried to hide, he would know the child wasn't hers. He might hurt the baby. Nissa reacted instinctively. She shoved him hard in the chest. "I said, leave me alone." Kale stumbled back, more surprised than hurt. But his surprise quickly morphed into fury. An Omega striking an Alpha was a severe offense. "You stupid bitch," he snarled, lunging forward. Before he could reach her, a sound shattered the quiet morning. It wasn't the howl of the wind, but the deep, resonating blast of a war horn. Echoing down the valley from the high pass, everyone in the village froze. Kale stopped mid-stride, his head snapping toward the sound. The elder emerged from the longhouse, his face drained of color. The horn blew again. Closer this time, followed by the thunderous sound of hooves crunching on the packed snow. "Riders!" someone shouted, their voice cracking with fear. "From the north!" From the north! The frost marches. Nissa's blood ran cold. She clutched Elian closer, the mark on her arm burning with a sudden, intense heat, as if anticipating the arrival of its creator. Through the gap in the palisade, they appeared. A contingent of riders, clad in dark furs and armor that gleamed like polished ice. They rode massive, shaggy horses, their breath pluming in the freezing air. At their head rode a man who commanded the space around him with terrifying stillness. He wore no helmet, revealing sharp, aristocratic features carved from pale stone and hair the color of midnight. Even from a distance, Nissa could feel the sheer, oppressive weight of his aura. It was a suffocating pressure that made the very air feel heavy. A raw power that spoke of violence and absolute control. This was Lucan, the Alpha King, the Ice King. He surveyed the pathetic village of Oakhaven with eyes that held no warmth, his gaze sweeping over the terrified villagers until it landed, with unerring precision, on Nissa. The breath caught in her throat. He wasn't looking at the village. He was looking at her. Or rather, he was looking at what she held. The king spurred his horse forward, breaking from his men. He rode slowly, deliberately, into the village square. The sound of his horse's hooves unnervingly loud in the absolute silence. He stopped mere feet from where Nissa stood, still holding her shovel, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Lucan dismounted. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, broad-shouldered and imposing. He moved with a predatory grace, every step silent and deadly. He stopped in front of her. Up close, his eyes were a terrifyingly pale silver, like the surface of a frozen lake, reflecting nothing but cold calculation. He didn't speak. He simply reached out a gloved hand and pushed back the hood of Nissa's cloak, revealing Elian's face. The baby looked up at the king, those pale blue eyes, so similar to the man's silver ones, wide and curious. A muscle ticked in Lucan's jaw. It was the only sign of emotion he showed. "My son." His voice was low, rough as crushed ice, and sent a shiver down Nissa's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He reached for the child. Nissa, acting on pure, reckless instinct, took a step back, shielding Elian. No, the collective gasp from the villagers was deafening. To deny the Alpha King was a death sentence. Lucan's silver eyes snapped from the baby to Nissa. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his hand. He merely stared at her, the oppressive weight of his aura intensifying until Nissa felt she might be crushed beneath it. "You dare," he murmured softly. As he stepped forward to take the child by force, he grabbed Nissa's arm to pull her closer. His grip was iron hard, his fingers wrapping around her forearm. The moment his hand closed over the mark, a shockwave of energy blasted outward, throwing snow into the air and causing Kale, who had been standing nearby, to stumble backward. Lucan froze, his eyes widening marginally. He looked down at Nysa's arm, where the black wolf's head was now glowing with a faint blue light, pulsing in time with the racing beat of her heart. He slowly looked up, his expression unreadable, a stormy mix of disbelief and something dark and terrifying. "An Omega," he stated, the words heavy with an unspoken threat. "An Omega bears my mark." The silence in the village square was absolute, broken only by the nervous stamp of the massive war horses. Lucan's grip on Nissa's arm remained like a vice of cold iron, his silver eyes fixed on the pulsing, azure glow of the mark. It shouldn't have been possible. The fates did not pair kings with Omegas. The magic of the mark was ancient, undeniable, and currently throwing the rigid hierarchy of his world into chaos. Slowly, the azure light subsided back to ink black, though the heat beneath Nissa's skin remained. Lucan released her arm as if it had suddenly turned to hot ash. He stepped back, the predatory grace of his movements replaced by a rigid, tightly coiled tension. "My lord," the village elder rasped, dropping to his knees in the snow, his forehead touching the freezing ground. We knew nothing of this. She is but a lowly thing, a wretch." Lucan didn't even look at the man. He raised a single gloved hand, and the elder's words died in his throat. The king's attention returned to Nysa, sweeping over her thin, ragged dress, her shivering frame, and finally resting on the small face of his son, safely tucked against her chest. "You kept him alive," Lucan stated. It wasn't a question, but a reluctant acknowledgement of a debt. "I couldn't leave him to the wolves," Nysa replied, her voice shaking but her chin tipped up. Her Omega instincts were screaming at her to submit, to cower before the overwhelming dominance radiating from this alpha. But the fragile life against her heart anchored her courage. Lucan's jaw clenched. "Mount up," he commanded, his voice carrying effortlessly over the howling wind that had begun to pick up again. "Bring her." Two massive warriors dismounted, their armor clanking. Nysa scrambled backward. "Wait! Where are you taking me? I won't let you hurt him." Lucan paused, one hand grasping the reins of his destrier. He looked back over his shoulder, his silver eyes pinning her in place. "He is my blood. I do not harm my own. As for you," his gaze flicked to her left arm. "The fates have played a cruel jest, but I do not leave what belongs to me in the dirt. You ride north." There was no room for argument. A hulking warrior grasped her gently but firmly by the shoulders, steering her toward a spare horse. Nysa looked back at Oakhaven. Kyle was still backed against the palisade, his face pale with terror. None of the villagers met her eye. They were already pretending she didn't exist. She was a ghost to them now, spirited away by the myth they all feared. They hoisted her onto a saddle, a terrifying height for someone who had never ridden. The warrior who helped her handed her the reins, his eyes dropping to the bundle in her arms with a strange mix of reverence and sorrow, before he returned to his own mount. The journey began immediately. The column moved swiftly, a line of dark riders cutting through the blinding white of the Vintergard wastes. Nysa clung to the saddle horn with one hand and shielded Elian with the other, her thighs aching, the biting wind slicing through her thin cloak like daggers. Hours bled into a blur of agonizing cold. Nysa's teeth chattered so violently she feared she would bite her own tongue. She hunched forward, trying to form a human shield over the baby, but her own core temperature was plummeting dangerously. Suddenly, the column halted, A shadow fell over her. Nissa blinked through her frost-crusted lashes to see Lucan alongside her mount. Without a word, he unclasped the massive, heavy direwolf pelt from his own shoulders. He leaned over and draped it over Nissa and the child, wrapping it tight. The immediate, suffocating warmth of the fur was intoxicating. But it was the scent that made Nissa's breath hitch. It smelled of crisp snow, ancient pines, and a deep, masculine musk that made the mark on her arm throb in sudden, sharp response. It was the scent of her fated mate. Lucan didn't linger. He didn't look at her face. He simply turned his horse back to the head of the column. Nissa buried her freezing nose into the fur, a single tear escaping and freezing on her cheek. The Ice King was a monster, they said. Yet, wrapped in his scent and his warmth, Nissa felt a terrifying spark of something she hadn't known in years. Safety. Caer Vinter loomed out of the blizzard like a jagged black tooth piercing the white sky. Built into the side of a massive mountain, the king's stronghold was a fortress of obsidian stone and impenetrable iron. As they rode through the colossal ironwood gates, the roaring wind was finally cut off, replaced by the echoing clatter of hooves on stone courtyards. Torches flared to life along the high walls, casting dancing shadows over the faces of the garrison soldiers, who watched their king's return in stunned silence. Their eyes invariably drifted to Nissa, a ragged, exhausted woman riding near the front, wrapped in the king's personal mantle, carrying a child. Lucan dismounted with fluid grace and barked a series of orders in a dialect so archaic Nissa couldn't parse the words. The men scrambled to obey. He strode over to Nissa's horse and reached up. Nissa hesitated, her arms tightening around Elian. Lucan's silver eyes flashed with a brief flare of irritation, but his hands remained steady, waiting. Slowly, she leaned forward, allowing him to grip her by the waist and lift her down. His touch was brief, impersonal, yet the heat of it burned right through her damp clothes. "Follow," he commanded briefly, turning on his heel. Nissa trailed behind him, navigating a labyrinth of dark stone corridors, tapestries depicting brutal northern battles, and massive roaring fireplaces that barely took the edge off the keep's innate chill. They emerged into a cavernous hall. At the far end sat an imposing throne, carved entirely from what looked like solid, pale blue ice. A handful of figures were gathered near the hearth. As Lucan entered, they bowed deeply. "My liege." A man stepped forward. He was older, his face scarred, a silver wolf pin fastening his cloak. This was Lord Thorn, Lucan's beta and most trusted advisor. "You have returned. We feared the worst when the trail went cold at the ridge." Lucan didn't offer a greeting. He simply stepped aside, revealing Nissa. The trail led to the southern valleys, to Oakhaven. Thorn's eyes locked onto the bundle in Nissa's arms. The color drained from the older man's scarred face. He took a stumbling step forward, his hand trembling as he reached toward the blanket. "Is it—" "By the gods, Lucan. Is it the prince?" "He lives," Lucan said, his voice flat, devoid of the relief that such news should carry. Against all odds, the ambush failed to claim him. Ambush. Nissa's mind raced. The baby hadn't just been abandoned. He had been left for dead following an attack. Thorn looked at Nissa, his brow furrowing in deep suspicion. And this woman, a wet nurse from the village? Lucan's silence was heavier than stone. He stared at the roaring fire for a long moment before turning to look at Nissa. The tension in the room spiked, thick and suffocating. "She is an Omega," Lucan said softly, the words echoing loudly in the vast hall. Thorn frowned, confused. "An Omega?" My king, surely we have capable servants here to tend to the child. You need not have dragged a villager. Show him, Lucan ordered, his eyes boring into Nissa's. Nissa swallowed hard. Her hands shook violently as she balanced Elian on one hip and used her free hand to push up the left sleeve of her worn dress, pushing past the heavy fur cloak Lucan had given her. The firelight caught the stark, black ink of the wolf crowned with jagged ice. A sharp intake of breath echoed through the hall. One of the noble women by the fire dropped her goblet, the metal clattering loudly against the stone floor, spilling dark wine like blood. Thorn stared at Nissa's arm, his eyes wide with horrified disbelief. A fated mark, Thorn whispered, looking from Nissa to Lucan. But she is an Omega. And you. The fates cannot mean this. The timing, right after the Queen's murder. Lucan's posture went terrifyingly rigid. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet instantly. Do not speak of her, he snarled, a low primal sound that vibrated in Nissa's chest. Thorn immediately bowed his head, cowed. Forgive me, my king. Lucan turned his back on the room, his broad shoulders rising and falling with forced, measured breaths. Prepare a chamber in the inner wing. The Omega stays with the child. She is to be guarded at all times. Neither of them leaves the keep. He didn't look back as he strode toward a dark archway. And Thorn. Lucan paused in the shadows, his voice a lethal whisper. Whoever betrayed us on that ridge is still alive. Find them, before I freeze this entire kingdom to the bedrock. The bedchamber was a study in imposing opulence. Heavy tapestries of midnight blue and silver covered walls of dark, polished stone. The bed was a massive affair of carved ironwood, piled high with furs of beasts Nissa couldn't even name. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast an ox. Yet the pervasive chill of Caervinter still seeped through the floorboards. Nissa stood in the center of the room, clutching Elian to her chest, listening to the heavy clack of the iron lock turning from the outside. She was a prisoner, a highly prized, closely guarded prisoner, but a captive nonetheless. She moved to the center of the room, laying Elian gently on the center of the massive bed. The child was quiet. Too quiet. The flush on his cheeks that had looked like a sign of returning health in Oakhaven now looked unnatural in the flickering firelight. Nissa pressed the back of her hand to his tiny forehead. It was terrifyingly hot. No, no, little one, Nissa whispered, her heart kicking into a frantic rhythm. The days in the freezing wastes were catching up to him. His small body was fighting a battle it barely had the strength for. She needed water, snow lily root and willow bark. She darted to the heavy oak door and pounded her fists against the thick wood. Guard, please, the child is sick. I need a healer. Silence answered her. She pounded again, her knuckles turning white. Please, he is burning up. She waited, her breath hitching in her throat. But no footsteps approached. The Alpha King had ordered them guarded, not tended to. To the soldiers of the keep, she was likely nothing more than a suspicious Omega from the dirt of the southern valleys. Nissa rushed back to the bed. Elian let out a thin, reedy whimper that twisted her heart to a painful knot. She stripped him down to his linen undergarments, taking a damp cloth from the wash basin and gently dabbing at his heated skin. It wasn't enough. The fever was spiking fast. Panic, raw and blinding, threatened to overwhelm her. She had saved him from the snow only to lose him to the fire in his blood. The heavy lock clicked. Nissa spun around, stepping protectively in front of the bed as the door swung open. Lucan stood in the threshold. He had shed his heavy armor, wearing only a dark tunic of spun wool and leather trousers. Yet he looked no less lethal. The oppressive, crackling energy of his alpha aura flooded the room, making Nisa's lungs feel too small for her chest. His silver eyes swept the room before locking onto her defensive posture. "Why are you shouting at my guards?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the walls. "He's sick," Nisa blurted out, her maternal terror momentarily eclipsing her ingrained instinct to cower. "He has a fever. It's rising too fast. He needs medicine." Lucan's expression hardened. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his presence so overwhelmingly dominant that Nisa physically stumbled backward to give him space. He looked down at the infant. Even to an untrained eye, the unnatural redness of the baby's skin and his rapid, shallow breathing were alarming. "I brought the court physician to examine him upon our arrival," Lucan said, his jaw tightening. "He said the child was merely exhausted." "Your physician is a fool," Nisa snapped, shocking herself. The words hung in the air, dangerous and treasonous. She slapped a hand over her mouth, but the defiance in her eyes remained. He spent hours in the snow. The cold burrowed into his chest. If we don't break this fever, he will seize. Lucan turned his head slowly to look at her. The air in the room felt thick enough to cut with a blade. An Omega had just insulted the king's staff and barked an order at him. Any other Alpha would have struck her down for the insolence. Nisa's arm throbbed violently. The black wolf mark beneath her sleeve burned as if a hot iron had been pressed against her skin. Lucan flinched infinitesimally, his own hand twitching toward his chest. He felt it too. The undeniable, magical tether that punished them both for this hostility. "What do you need?" Lucan asked, the words forced out through gritted teeth. "Snow lily root, willow bark, and a mortar and pestle." Nisa answered instantly, her voice trembling but resolute. "Quickly, please." Lucan didn't argue. He turned on his heel and strode to the door, pulling it open. "Bring me the master healer's satchel," he barked to the unseen guard in the hall. "Now, if he argues, relieve him of his head." He slammed the door shut, trapping them in the suffocating silence once more. Lucan stood by the hearth, staring into the flames, his broad back to her. The tension rolling off him was like a physical weight. Nisa turned back to Elian, continuing to bathe his skin, murmuring soft, melodic words in the old tongue of her village. A lullaby of healing and endurance. "You do not sound like a northern peasant," Lucan said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet room. He had turned to watch her, his silver eyes tracking the gentle, capable movements of her hands. "I was not always a peasant," Nisa replied softly, not looking up. "My mother was a healer from the deep forests of the east, before she died." Lucan's gaze dropped to her left arm, though the mark was hidden by her sleeve. "And she taught you how to pull a dying prince from the jaws of winter?" Before Nisa could answer, the door opened, and a breathless guard thrust a heavy leather satchel into the room. Lucan took it and brought it to the small table near the bed. He dumped the contents, glass vials, dried herbs, and a stone mortar, onto the wood. "Do it," the Ice King commanded, stepping back to let the Omega work. Nisa moved with a practiced, desperate speed. She dug through the dried herbs, her fingers deftly selecting the pale bark of the willow and the dried, star-shaped roots of the snow lily. She crushed them together in the mortar, the sharp, pungent scent of the medicine cutting through the smoky air of the bedchamber. Lucan watched her. He stood perfectly still, a silent sentinel in the shadows of the room. He noticed the way her hands, though red and chapped from the cold, moved with an elegant precision. There was no hesitation in her actions, only a fierce, focused determination. It was a stark contrast to the terrified, shivering creature he had pulled from the snow in Oakhaven. She poured a small amount of hot water from the kettle over the hearth into a cup, adding the crushed powder. "I need to sit him up," she murmured. To her surprise, Lucan moved closer. He didn't speak, but he reached down and slid his large, calloused hands beneath the infant, lifting Elian with a shocking gentleness. The baby looked impossibly small against the king's broad chest. Nissa hesitated for a fraction of a second, intimidated by his proximity. The heat radiating from his body was intoxicating, and the scent of pine and crisp snow made her pulse race. She forced her hands to steady and brought the cup to Elian's lips, carefully tilting it to let a few drops of the bitter liquid fall onto his tongue. Elian sputtered, his tiny face screwing up in distaste, but his instinct to swallow won out. Over the next hour, they worked in a bizarre, silent tandem. Nissa administering the medicine drop by drop, and the terrifying Alpha King holding his son with unyielding patience. Gradually, the terrifying heat radiating from the child began to ebb. His strained breathing smoothed out into a deep, rhythmic slumber. Nissa let out a ragged sigh of relief, her shoulders slumping as the adrenaline left her system. Lucan gently laid the sleeping baby back onto the center of the bed and pulled a soft fur over him. He then turned his full, paralyzing attention back to Nissa. "You have bought him time," Lucan said, his voice quiet in the dim room. "Now, you will give me answers." Nissa backed away slightly, putting the table between them. "I told you everything in the village. I found him in a drift. You found him wrapped in my late wife's mantle," Lucan corrected, his eyes narrowing, flashing with a dangerous silver light. A mantle she was wearing when her carriage was ambushed on the southern ridge. Nissa swallowed hard. I knew nothing of an ambush. I only saw the bundle." Lucan took a slow step forward. The predator was back, circling his prey. "My finest trackers lost the trail in the blizzard. Yet you, an Omega living on the outskirts of nowhere, stumbled upon the crown prince of Caer Vinter. Explain the scent." "Scent?" Nissa asked, confused. "When you found the velvet," Lucan pressed, closing the distance until he was only an arm's length away. Nissa's mark throbbed a frantic, aching rhythm, begging her to submit to the Alpha before her. She gripped the edge of the table to keep herself upright. Before the snow washed it away entirely, what did the fabric smell of? Not the blood. What else? Nissa closed her eyes, forcing herself to return to that freezing morning. She remembered the stiff velvet, the terrifying stillness. She had brought it to her face, checking for breath. "It smelled of ozone," she whispered, "like lightning." Lucan's face remained impassive, but his posture went rigid. "Sorcery, and—" Nissa hesitated, digging deeper into her memory. Her mother had trained her nose for herbs. Underneath the damp wool, it smelled sweet, too sweet, like crushed pits. Lucan's eyes snapped wide. "Bitter almond?" Nissa nodded slowly. "Yes, but heavier, like black root." The silence that followed was absolute. Lucan stared at her, a muscle feathering in his jaw. Black root was a paralyzing agent. It didn't grow in the frost marches. It was a weed native only to the sweltering deep bogs of the southern kingdoms, the lands of King Ethelgard, Lucan's sworn ally. "Blackroot," Lucan repeated softly, the word dripping with venom. The ambush hadn't been rogue bandits. It had been a coordinated, politically backed assassination, aided by someone inside his own court who had access to foreign poisons. He looked at Nissa, seeing her not just as a miraculous wet nurse or an infuriating glitch of fated magic, But as the only witness who held a piece of the puzzle, instinctively, Lucan reached out. He didn't grab her roughly this time. His fingertips brushed against her left arm, right over the sleeve where the mark lay hidden. The moment of contact sent a jolt of pure, white-hot electricity through them both. Nissa gasped, her knees buckling. Lucan's hand shot out, catching her around the waist before she hit the floor. He hauled her flush against his chest. For a breathless second, the Alpha King and the lowly Omega were pressed together. Nissa looked up, terrified, into eyes that were no longer just cold silver, but swirling with a dark, primal hunger that terrified her more than his wrath. The mark binding them was waking up, and neither the ice of Caer Vinter nor the king's iron will seemed capable of freezing it over. The inner wing of Caer Vinter was a place of oppressive silence. It was reserved for the royal bloodline and their most trusted kin. And Nissa, a peasant with nothing but a tattered cloak and a mysterious past, did not belong. Every time she walked the hallways, the tapestries seemed to watch her, and the stone floors felt like ice beneath her feet. Word of her presence had spread, as it always did in a castle built on intrigue. She was the Omega of the Mark, the king's burden, and more viciously, the village spy. Nissa spent her days in the nursery, a space of gilded luxury that felt entirely too large for a single infant. Elian was recovering, the fever long broken, but he remained quiet, his pale eyes tracking Nissa with an intelligence that seemed far too advanced for a baby of his few months. On the fourth day, the doors to the nursery opened with a sharp crack. A woman entered, draped in furs of white ermine, her face a mask of painted perfection. This was Lady Isolde, a cousin to the king, and a woman whose ambition was as sharp as the icicles clinging to the parapets. "So," Isolde said, her voice dropping into a tone of synthetic sweetness, "you are the one who has captured our king's attention. Or perhaps trapped him." Nissa did not look up from the poultice she was grinding. "I am merely the one who saved the prince's life, my lady." Isolde glided forward, her footsteps silent. She stopped by the cradle, peering down at Elian with a look of distaste. Saving a child does not grant a commoner the right to live among nobility. You have the mark, yes? A tragedy of fate, or a desperate attempt at a rise in station? I asked for none of this, Nissa said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. She could feel the mark on her arm pulsing, a dull, warning ache. It always reacted when she was stressed, and Isolde's presence felt like a jagged blade against her senses. Isolde leaned in close, the scent of heavy lilies and winter musk overpowering. Do not mistake the king's patience for affection. Lucan is a man of logic, not heart. He tolerates you only because you are tethered to his son. Once the prince is strong, you will find that the ice of this castle has no room for creatures of the sun. I have no desire for the warmth of the court, Nissa replied, finally standing to meet the woman's gaze. I only wish to see the child healthy. Isolde's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine venom crossing her features. You are a threat, girl. An anomaly. And anomalies in Caer Vinter are pruned before they can spread. Before Nissa could respond, the heavy doors groaned open again. Lucan stood in the frame. The air in the room instantly pressurized. Isolde spun around, her demeanor changing in a heartbeat from predatory to fawning. Lucan, my king, I was just... Leave, Lucan commanded. It was not a request. It was a sentence. Isolde hesitated, her face flushing. But the absolute freezing authority in the king's eyes brooked no argument. She curtsied deeply, casting one last hateful glare at Nissa before sweeping out of the room. Lucan didn't even watch her go. He stepped into the nursery, the weight of his presence pulling the oxygen from the room. He walked to the cradle, looking down at Elian. The baby gurgled, reaching a tiny hand toward the king. Lucan didn't touch him, but his posture softened by a fraction. "She was bothering you," he said, not as a question. She was stating the obvious. Nissa replied, returning to her work. "I do not belong here." Lucan turned, his silver gaze locking onto her. "You belong where I place you. And for now, that is here, under my protection." "Is that what this is?" Nissa asked, her voice tight with the strain of their proximity. "Protection? Or a gilded cage to keep your witness under lock and key?" Lucan crossed the room in 2 strides, invading her space until she was forced to look up at him. "Both," he confessed, his voice dangerously low. "The court is a den of vipers, Nissa, and you are the only person in this frozen hell who smells of truth." The night was long and filled with the howling of wind against the black stone of the keep. Nissa lay in the narrow cot provided for her, but sleep was a stranger. The mark on her arm was burning, a constant, rhythmic thrum that matched the beating of her own heart. It was more than just a mark, it was a link. She could feel him. Even now, through the thick stone walls, she felt the jagged edges of Lucan's anger, the frost-heavy weight of his duty, and a deep, festering sorrow that he kept hidden from the world. It was a psychic ache, a tether that tugged at her, demanding she be near him. She sat up, clutching her arm. The mark was glowing faintly, casting a soft blue luminescence on her linens. "He is in pain," she realized, the thought appearing in her mind as clearly as if she had spoken it. She stood, grabbing a heavy wool blanket, and crept out of the nursery. She knew the layout of the keep by now. She knew where the king's solar was. She found him sitting by the hearth in his private study. He had stripped off his tunic, revealing a torso mapped with scars, the history of 1,000 battles. He was hunched over, his head in his hands, his knuckles white. The air around him was freezing, frost coating the edges of his desk. He was losing control of his aura. Nissa hesitated, the instinct to run battling the instinct to heal. The mark on her arm seared. "Go to him," it commanded. She took a step forward. "Lucan?" He didn't move, but his voice was a ragged growl. "Leave. I am unstable." "I know," she said, stepping further into the room. The cold was biting, enough to numb her fingers, but she pushed through it. "I can feel you." Lucan's head snapped up. His eyes were not human. They were swirling vortexes of silver, wild and untamed. "You shouldn't be able to feel anything from an alpha," he said, his voice straining. "The bond is a curse, not a parlor trick. It is a connection," Nissa corrected, reaching the edge of the hearth. "And right now, it is the only thing keeping you from shattering the stone around us." She knelt beside him, placing her hand firmly on his shoulder. The contact was like plunging into a glacial river. The shock of his cold, raw power flooded her system, but she didn't pull away. She focused on the mark on her arm, channeling the heat she had felt when she first touched Elian, the heat of survival, of life. She pushed that warmth toward him, not through magic, but through intention. Lucan gasped, his entire body shuddering. The frost on the desk began to retreat. His eyes flickered, the silver dimming as he fought for grip. "You," he started, his voice barely a whisper. "Why?" "Because you are dying," Nissa said, her voice thick with emotion. "You are holding the weight of this entire kingdom on your shoulders, and you are letting the grief of your wife's death poison you from the inside out." Lucan flinched as if she had struck him. He looked at her, his expression a chaotic storm of shock and betrayal. "You know nothing of her. I know she was loved," Nisa said, her hand still firm on his shoulder. "And I know that holding on to the poison of her death will kill you, and it will leave your son with nothing but a throne of ice." Lucan reached up, his large, calloused hand covering hers on his shoulder. His skin was still cold, but the vibration of his aura had settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse that matched the mark on her arm. For the first time since she had arrived at Caer Vinter, the predator was gone, replaced by a man who was utterly, devastatingly exhausted. "The Blackroot," he murmured, his gaze falling to the fire. "It didn't just come from the south. I found a courier, a man in my own guard. He was carrying a seal from the High Council." Nissa's blood ran cold. "Your own council? They want you dead. They want the throne," Lucan said, his jaw tightening. "They want a king they can control, an alpha who doesn't possess the fated mark. They want to break the bloodline." Nisa looked at the mark on her arm, then at the man who was supposed to be her enemy, her captor, her king. The realization settled in her gut, heavy and undeniable. They were two sides of the same coin, trapped in a game they barely understood. "Then we have to survive," she whispered. Lucan looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't look at her as an Omega or a peasant or a piece on a chessboard. He looked at her as an equal. "We do," he agreed, "but the cost will be high, Nisa." "I am used to the cost," she replied. "I was born in the snow." The quiet of the keep was shattered before the dawn. It began as a vibration, a low rhythmic thumping that seemed to shake the very foundations of Caer Vinter. Nisa, barely having slept, was awake instantly. Beside the hearth, Elian stirred, his small brow furrowed in his sleep. The heavy iron door to the nursery groaned, then buckled. It didn't just open. It was blasted off its hinges by a wave of concentrated, dark energy. Nissa scrambled to shield the cradle, her heart hammering against her ribs. Standing in the ruin of the doorway was not a guard, but Lord Thorn. His face was a mask of cold, calculated detachment. In his hand, he held a dagger forged of black glass, the same material used in the forbidden arts of the southern swamps. "You were always an interference, Nisa," Thorn said, his voice devoid of the warmth he had displayed only hours before. "The king is a creature of sentiment now, weakened by a ghost of the past and the heat of a peasant girl." "You," Nisa whispered, the horror sinking into her bones. "You were the one who poisoned the carriage. You betrayed him." Thorn stepped into the room, his eyes flicking to the cradle. "I betrayed nothing. I serve the stability of the realm. A king who mourns is a king who falters, and a king who bonds with an Omega. He destroys the legacy of the bloodline entirely. I am merely correcting the error." Nisa stood, positioning herself between the traitor and the child. The mark on her arm began to burn, not with pain, but with a searing, white-hot intensity. She could feel Lucan. He was close. He was furious. "You think you can prune the anomaly," Nisa said, her voice growing stronger, fueled by the bond that pulsed through her veins. "But you don't understand what you're dealing with." Thorn lunged. Nisa didn't pull away. She reached out, grasping the air before her as if she were molding clay. She felt the magic of the bond, that strange, electric tether, and she pulled on it. She didn't use it to defend. She used it to call. "Lucan." The room exploded. A wall of pure, crystalline ice erupted from the floor, pinning Thorn against the opposite wall. The ceiling groaned, frost spiraling down in blinding sheets. Lucan appeared in the doorway, his eyes burning with an incandescent, terrifying silver light. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a force of nature. He walked through the ice as if it were air, his gaze locked solely on Thorn. "You," Lucan said, his voice a vibration that shattered the remaining glass in the room. Thorn struggled against the ice, his face turning purple. "He is not fit to rule," he choked out. "He is the future," Lucan countered, raising his hand. The frost on the floor climbed up Thorn's robes, freezing him in place, turning his skin to the color of granite. Lucan didn't kill him. He looked at Nysa, then at the child, and finally back to the traitor. "You will be the first to rot in the deep dungeons of the keep. You will watch from the shadows as this kingdom thrives without your stability." With a flick of his wrist, the ice solidified, trapping Thorn in a prison of his own making. Silence rushed back into the room. Lucan turned to Nysa. The storm in his eyes slowly abated, the silver fading back to a more human shade. He walked to the cradle, checking Eliane, then turned to her. "You called me?" he said, his voice quiet. "The bond?" she replied, her arm aching where the mark had blazed so bright. "It's not a chain, Lucan. It's a bridge." Lucan looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the strength beneath her fragility, the healer who had defied death itself to save his son. He reached out, not to touch her, but to acknowledge her. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth he was finally allowing himself to keep. "We survive," he said. "We do." Nysa agreed, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. And for the first time, the snow outside doesn't feel like a grave. It feels like a beginning. The Ice King and the Omega, the ruler and the witness, stood together in the nursery. The fire crackled, casting long, warm shadows against the stone, as the threat of the past finally, mercifully, began to melt away. The winds of Caer Vinter still howl, but they no longer carry the bite of death. In the heart of the ice, a new story of resilience and unity has begun to take root. Nysa and Lucan have navigated the treacherous path of trust, proving that even the coldest winters must eventually give way to the promise of spring. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the frozen wastes. If you found yourself caught in the spell of the Alpha King and his Omega, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to support more tales of magic, survival, and unexpected bonds. Stay tuned for our next adventure. The frost is fading, but the story is far from over.